It started like any other calm, sunny afternoon. The kind of day where the breeze is soft, the birds are chirping, and all you want is to enjoy a little peace in your own front yard. My wife had decided to step outside to water the flowers she'd planted just a couple of weeks ago. She's always had a green thumb, the kind of person who can bring a dying plant back to life with a little patience and care. She was wearing comfortable clothes, nothing flashy, just simple workout gear, hair tied back, a water hose in hand, quietly going about her business. There was nothing suspicious, nothing unusual. At least, not to any normal person. But in our neighborhood, nothing gets past the watchful eye of the HOA. More specifically, nothing escapes the laser gaze of Karen. You know the type, clipboard under one arm, sunglasses on like she's in the FBI, and this unshakable belief that the entire street falls under her personal jurisdiction. She doesn't work for the HOA. She volunteers. Aggressively. Always circling the block. Ready to enforce community standards. Which really means reporting things that don't meet her personal vision of suburban perfection. That day, she happened to be on patrol, or whatever she calls it, making her rounds like she was inspecting troops. As my wife tended to the flower beds, Karen stopped dead in her tracks. I wasn't outside at the time, but I caught the entire thing later on the doorbell camera. There was that familiar pause. One you see in people when their brain is trying to make sense of something they don't understand. Karen narrowed her eyes and stepped closer, pretending to be interested in a bush nearby, all while glancing suspiciously at my wife. Then it happened. She walked up, arms folded tightly, and asked in the most condescending tone imaginable, "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" My wife looked up, confused, and replied kindly, "I live here." Karen didn't buy it. She tilted her head, clearly scanning for signs. Did my wife have a key? Did she come out of the front door? Was she wearing anything HOA approved? My wife remained calm, still holding the hose, now half wondering whether this woman was joking. But Karen wasn't joking. She doubled down. "Oh? And do you have proof of that?" "I've never seen you around here before," she said, her tone dripping with suspicion. My wife, caught off guard, said calmly, "We moved in 3 months ago. I've been out here plenty of times." But that answer wasn't good enough for Karen. Instead of leaving it at that, she took out her phone. That's when things started to turn. Karen began dialing someone, clearly escalating, saying things like, "I have a trespasser here, and she doesn't belong here." My wife asked who she was calling, and Karen, without hesitation, replied, "The sheriff." My wife didn't panic. She knew exactly what this was about. It wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken for someone who didn't belong, and sadly, it probably wouldn't be the last. But this time, it was different. This was happening in our front yard, on our property, with someone calling the police because she assumed, based on nothing but how my wife looked, that she couldn't possibly live there. Meanwhile, Karen kept pacing around, phone in one hand, muttering things about neighborhood safety, security, and strangers. The part that struck me most, watching the footage later, was the way Karen never once asked anything kind or respectful. Not a single, "Are you okay?" or "Can I help with something?" It was pure entitlement wrapped in the false veil of authority. Karen wasn't looking out for the neighborhood. She was looking to catch someone she thought didn't belong, someone who didn't fit her picture of who should live in this community. While all this unfolded, I had no idea any of it was happening. I was inside on a work call. By the time I stepped out to see what was going on, the police car was already pulling into the driveway. Lights off, no sirens, just a slow roll up to her home like this was some routine check. Karen stood to the side, smug expression on her face, arms crossed, looking like she'd just solved a crime. My wife stood still, arms at her side now, the hose shut off, her eyes watching the officer approach. Everything was quiet for a moment, like time had paused just to see how this would unfold. From the moment Karen first laid eyes on my wife that afternoon, it was clear she had already made up her mind. Not based on anything my wife had done, not because she was acting suspiciously or breaking any rules, but simply because of how she looked. That's the uncomfortable truth. My wife didn't fit the image Karen had of someone who belongs in this neighborhood. And in places like ours, pristine lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA manual thicker than a phone book, that image seems to be everything. It's an unspoken, unwritten standard that's been crafted and protected by people like Karen for years, and my wife, despite living there, despite paying the same dues, despite being just as much a homeowner as anyone else, was immediately treated like an outsider. Karen didn't stop to consider that my wife might live there. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask a polite question, didn't even seem to register the possibility that she could be speaking to a neighbor. No, what Karen saw was someone unfamiliar, someone who didn't match the cookie-cutter mold, and she let her assumptions do the rest. That's the kind of profiling that doesn't always make the news but happens in thousands of subtle, quiet moments like this one, moments where someone decides who you are before you even open your mouth. There's something incredibly dehumanizing about that kind of judgment. To look at someone and immediately place them in a box. To decide that they're a threat, a problem, or a trespasser not because of what they're doing but because of what they look like while doing it. My wife wasn't yelling, she wasn't damaging property, she wasn't loitering or even walking around. She was standing in front of our home, watering plants. That's it. But to Karen, that act somehow became suspicious. Why? Because Karen didn't recognize her? Because she didn't look the part? Or because some deeper, uglier assumption kicked in the moment she saw her? The irony is, my wife has spent years serving her country, working with dignity and discipline, earning respect in places far tougher than a gated cul-de-sac. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Karen didn't see the years of service, the strength, the professionalism. She saw a woman who, in her eyes, didn't belong. And that was enough for her to feel threatened. Enough to feel entitled to challenge her. Enough to call the police. And what does that say about the community we live in? A place that prides itself on safety, on neighborliness, on watching out for each other, yet can be so quick to judge someone by their skin, their clothes, their presence? It's easy for people like Karen to claim they're just being cautious or just doing their job, but let's be real. This wasn't caution. It was prejudice disguised as concern. And while Karen may have felt justified in her actions, they stemmed from a place of fear, of ignorance, and of unchecked privilege. It's not always about loud words or obvious slurs. Sometimes it's about the quiet, subtle ways people decide who's in and who's out. My wife didn't need to be shouted at or harassed for the message to be clear. You don't look like you live here, so I'm going to treat you like a threat until proven otherwise. That's the mindset that fueled this entire encounter. It wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. It was about maintaining a certain image of the neighborhood. One where difference is treated with suspicion instead of curiosity, where unfamiliarity is seen as danger instead of an opportunity to connect. What hurts more is that my wife didn't even react with anger. She didn't shout back or cause a scene. She stood there, calm, dignified, knowing exactly what was happening but choosing not to let it shake her. Because this wasn't the first time. People like my wife are constantly expected to prove they belong, to overperform just to be seen as equal. And while Karen may not have realized it, what she did that day was not just call the sheriff. She reinforced every stereotype, every assumption, every wall that divides communities rather than brings them together. After deciding that my wife didn't belong in our own front yard, Karen took the situation to a level that was entirely unnecessary. Instead of walking away or even choosing to ask a few respectful questions, she did what many self-righteous HOA vigilantes seem to love doing. She escalated. With her phone clutched tightly in her hand like a badge of authority, she walked a few feet away and dialed the sheriff. It wasn't just the act of calling the police that stood out. It was the self-important, almost triumphant way she did it, like she believed she was catching someone red-handed in the act of watering plants. The absurdity of it didn't seem to faze her at all. To Karen, this was her moment. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore, she had cast herself as the lead in some imaginary crime drama unfolding in the suburbs. Her voice, according to the doorbell camera's audio, was clear and direct. Yes, I need to report a trespasser. She says she lives here, but I've never seen her before. She's acting suspicious. Suspicious. That word carries weight. That word gets people hurt. That word, when used in the wrong context, can turn an ordinary situation into a life-altering one. And all it took for Karen to throw it out there was the sight of a woman she didn't recognize with brown skin and a hose. There was no attempt to resolve the matter peacefully. No, let's figure this out. No, would you mind verifying your address? Just a call straight to law enforcement, as if that was the most reasonable response to someone doing yard work. It's frightening how quickly some people will involve the police when it comes to situations they don't understand or people they don't want to understand. There's this dangerous mindset that calling the cops is a neutral action, that it's always the responsible next step. But when you're calling the police on someone who has done absolutely nothing wrong, especially based on biased assumptions, it's anything but harmless. The worst part is Karen probably thought she was doing the right thing. In her head, she was probably convinced she was protecting the neighborhood from a potential threat. She had no idea who my wife was, what she's done, or how long we'd lived there. None of that mattered to her. The fact that she didn't recognize my wife was enough to trigger a series of actions that could have gone in a completely different direction. People have lost their lives over far less. And while this situation didn't end in violence, the intention behind Karen's actions revealed a troubling truth: she was willing to risk someone else's safety just to feel comfortable in her assumptions. Calling the cops is not a small thing. It's not a casual button you press when you're slightly uncomfortable. It's a powerful action with real consequences, especially when weaponized against people who are already marginalized. Karen's call wasn't about following rules or maintaining order. It was about control. It was about putting my wife in her place, sending a message that this neighborhood has standards and you're not part of it. That's what made it so disturbing, not just the action itself, but the smugness behind it, the entitlement she displayed, as if she had the authority to decide who belongs and who doesn't. My wife stood there the whole time, dignified and quiet, even as Karen described her to the dispatcher like a suspect. She's around 5 feet 7 inches, dark hair, athletic build, wearing a gray top. You could hear in her voice that she was trying to sound calm and objective, but her words were laced with judgment. She gave off that fake cordial tone people use when they want to sound reasonable but are really fanning the flames. All while the woman she was talking about stood 10 feet away, doing absolutely nothing threatening. What made it all worse was the knowledge that if my wife had reacted even slightly out of frustration, if she had raised her voice or gotten visibly upset, Karen would have used that as more evidence that she was dangerous. That's the trap. When you're being falsely accused, you're expected to stay calm and collected, because any sign of emotion becomes ammunition. My wife knew this, and she didn't take the bait. She just waited. Waited for the sheriff to arrive. Waited to be judged not by her actions but by appearances. Waited to see whether the system Karen trusted so much would fall into the same trap. The sheriff's vehicle pulled up slowly, cruising into the neighborhood with a calm, almost deliberate pace. No lights, no sirens, just the quiet hum of the engine as it rolled to a stop at the edge of our driveway. Karen stood there stiffly, her arms still folded, watching with an air of self-satisfaction, as if the arrival of law enforcement was her victory. She pointed subtly in my wife's direction, as if she had done her civic duty, as if she had uncovered some criminal act that demanded attention. My wife stood quietly beside the garden, the hose now resting at her side, eyes fixed on the officer stepping out of the car. The sheriff was a tall man, dressed in his standard-issue tan uniform, sunglasses covering his eyes, a radio clipped to his shoulder, and a badge that gleamed slightly under the afternoon sun. He scanned the area briefly, taking in the scene, my wife standing calmly near the flower bed, Karen a few feet away with the unmistakable posture of someone who felt they had just saved the day. It was the kind of moment that crackled with tension, not because anyone was yelling or fighting, but because of the unspoken weight in the air. The assumption that had driven this entire event was now meeting the reality of who my wife truly was. The sheriff took a few steps forward, his boots crunching softly against the driveway gravel. Then something unexpected happened. He stopped about 5 feet from my wife, removed his sunglasses, and for a moment he just looked at her. His eyes widened slightly, like he recognized her immediately. A flicker of realization crossed his face, then something even more telling: respect. Without hesitation, without a single question, he brought his hand to his forehead and gave her a sharp, formal salute. That gesture cut through the silence like a bolt of lightning. It was unmistakable, precise, and filled with meaning. A salute isn't casual. It's not something given lightly. It's a symbol of honor, of recognition, of gratitude. And in that moment, the dynamic shifted completely. My wife returned the salute with quiet dignity, nodding once in acknowledgement. There were no words exchanged between them at first, none were needed. The sheriff knew exactly who she was, and that simple act made it crystal clear that she wasn't just any woman standing outside her home. She was someone who had earned that salute through years of service, sacrifice, and distinction. Karen's face told the whole story. Her self-satisfied smile faltered, then vanished completely. You could see the confusion washing over her as she tried to process what had just happened. She glanced between the sheriff and my wife, trying to make sense of a scene that no longer fit the narrative she had crafted. This wasn't the response she had expected. She had anticipated backup, authority on her side, validation of her assumptions. What she got instead was a silent rebuke, a public moment of respect directed not at her, but at the very person she had accused of not belonging. The sheriff finally turned to Karen, and while I couldn't hear the exact words he used, his tone was calm but firm. His body language said everything. The situation was under control, there was no issue here, and the complaint was not only unfounded but completely inappropriate. Karen stammered slightly, gesturing vaguely toward the garden, the hose, as if those everyday objects could somehow justify her overreaction. But the confidence she had when she made that call had melted into uncertainty. The badge she thought would enforce her assumptions had instead revealed her ignorance. The sheriff didn't linger. He exchanged a few more words with my wife, quiet, respectful, and likely unnecessary because this wasn't a matter of criminal concern. It was a moment that demanded no legal intervention, only human decency. And in that rare show of recognition, the sheriff didn't just acknowledge my wife's right to be there, he acknowledged her presence as someone who had done more for this country than most of us ever will. That silent salute became the turning point. It reframed the entire narrative in an instant. Karen, who had walked up confidently believing she had the upper hand, was now left standing awkwardly in the driveway, her assumptions unraveling with every passing second. The sheriff's respect made it clear that my wife didn't just belong here, she deserved more recognition than Karen could have ever imagined. Karen stood frozen, like someone who had just been caught in a lie they didn't realize could be so publicly exposed. Her arms were still crossed, but now more as a shield than a stance of authority. Her confident expression had drained into something between disbelief and embarrassment. The woman she had called the cops on, the one she claimed didn't belong in the neighborhood, had just been saluted by the sheriff. And not just a polite nod or handshake, but a full, military-grade salute that carried weight, history, and unmistakable respect. There's something about being so sure of your place in a situation and then watching that foundation crumble in front of your eyes. Karen had constructed an entire narrative based on her own narrow view of the world. She thought she knew who belonged in this community and who didn't. She thought she was acting as a protector, a watchdog, even a hero. But in one moment, one crisp, deliberate motion from the sheriff, her assumptions were shattered. And she didn't know what to do with that. The silence between the three of them stretched awkwardly. My wife remained poised, saying nothing, letting Karen's discomfort sit in the open air. The sheriff, having clearly made his position known, stood calmly beside his vehicle, radiating a sense of control that made it clear the situation was not going to escalate. Karen, meanwhile, was fidgeting. Her hands moved to her phone, then to her hip, then back to her folded arms again. She looked around, maybe hoping for someone to intervene, or maybe hoping this moment would somehow disappear. Didn't, and that's what made it so powerful. Karen's reaction wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no shouts, no tears, no frantic apologies. Just stunned silence, a kind of wordless retreat that spoke louder than any excuse she could have offered. Her body language gave her away. Shoulders hunched slightly inward, jaw tight, eyes no longer making direct contact with anyone. She looked like she wanted to vanish into the perfectly trimmed hedges she was always so concerned about. The thing is, people like Karen often move through the world without ever being challenged. They operate on unspoken rules built on privilege and assumptions, rarely forced to reflect on the damage those assumptions can cause. But in this case, the person she targeted wasn't just another neighbor she didn't know. My wife wasn't just a civilian who could be brushed off or quietly dismissed. She was someone who had earned a level of recognition Karen clearly didn't anticipate. And that recognition had now played out right in front of her. There was a shift in the atmosphere. Not just between Karen and my wife, but in the energy of the neighborhood itself. A few people had started to peek through windows or glance from porches, curious about the sheriff's visit. It was the kind of moment that lingered, one people would talk about later, with phrases like, "Did you see what happened on Elmwood?" Or, "I didn't know she was military." Karen, who was always the first to circulate gossip and patrol the sidewalks, now found herself at the center of the story for all the wrong reasons. And what made it worse for her was that there was no graceful way to exit. She had started this. She had called it in. She had staked her judgment on a gut feeling, and that feeling had been proven not just wrong, but disgracefully so. To backpedal now would be to admit that her instincts were rooted in bias, not concern. To apologize would mean facing the possibility that she had embarrassed not just herself, but the very community she thought she was protecting. And so she did nothing. She froze. She remained there for a few more seconds, then turned slowly and walked away, stiff, measured, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. But the damage had already been done. My wife, for her part, never flinched. She didn't gloat. She didn't mock or confront. She didn't need to. The facts had spoken for themselves, and the sheriff's salute had done all the talking that needed to be done. The contrast between the two women was striking. One, composed and calm, having earned her place through years of service and integrity. The other unraveled by a moment she had completely misjudged. Karen's retreat wasn't just a physical movement away from the scene, it was a symbolic collapse of the certainty she had felt just minutes earlier. And though she may have walked away, the silence she left behind echoed louder than any argument she could have tried to make. In the aftermath of the confrontation, something subtle but significant began to settle over the neighborhood. Conversations that used to be casual, passing, and filled with surface-level niceties now came with a pause, a glance, a thought left unspoken. People had seen what happened. Maybe not all the details, but enough to understand that something shifted that afternoon. Something about the way we treat each other, about how we define community, and more importantly, how we misjudge those who don't fit our expectations. Karen's actions didn't just impact my wife. They sent a message to everyone watching, and now that message needed to be addressed. Respect is easy to talk about in theory. It's written into HOA newsletters, printed on little signs at community events, and thrown around in mission statements. But it means very little if it isn't extended to everyone equally. My wife was not a stranger. She was a homeowner, a decorated professional, someone who had chosen to live in that neighborhood with the same hopes and rights as anyone else. Yet she had to prove her belonging, not through her words, not by showing ID or presenting a deed, but through the authority of someone else recognizing her value. That moment, when the sheriff saluted, should never have been necessary in the first place. My wife shouldn't have needed a uniformed officer to validate her right to stand in her own yard. But that's what makes these moments so deeply frustrating. People like my wife often have to be overqualified just to be treated with basic decency. She didn't get the benefit of the doubt. She got suspicion. She didn't get a neighborly introduction. She got a phone call to the police. And even after being proven completely innocent, respected, in fact, far beyond what Karen expected, there was no apology, no real acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. Humility is something that doesn't often show up in these kinds of situations, but it should. It takes humility to admit when you've made a mistake, to recognize that your assumptions led you down the wrong path. Karen had the opportunity to grow, to see the human impact of her actions, to reflect on how quick she was to judge. But instead, she chose silence. And that silence, while not loud or confrontational, said enough. It revealed an unwillingness to learn, to change, to consider that the problem wasn't my wife's presence, it was her own perception of it. What happened that day forced a lot of us to think about what kind of neighborhood we really wanted to be part of. Was it one where people feel watched instead of welcomed? Where differences met with suspicion instead of curiosity? Where the comfort of a few outweighs the dignity of others? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary. Because real community can't be built on fear and judgment. It has to be grounded in empathy, in trust, and in the willingness to confront our own biases, even the quiet ones we don't speak out loud. The truth is, Karen's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a larger pattern that plays out in neighborhoods all across the country. People being profiled for walking their dog, sitting in a park, entering their own homes. People being asked to explain themselves just to exist in spaces they already belong to. It's the kind of thing that erodes the very fabric of what community is supposed to be about. And unless we're willing to call it out, to challenge it when we see it, it keeps happening quietly, persistently, and often with no consequences. But there's also an opportunity here. An opportunity to do better, to raise the standard not just for behavior, but for thought. To stop pretending that surface-level politeness is enough. To actually look at how power, race, class, and perception intersect in everyday interactions. To stop assuming the worst and start asking better questions. To move beyond the idea of protecting the neighborhood and toward truly building one. It starts with something simple but powerful: respect. Not the kind you reserve for people in uniform or those who've earned medals, but the kind that says, I see you. I recognize your humanity. I trust that you belong here just as much as I do. And along with respect comes humility, the kind that allows us to admit we were wrong, to grow from the discomfort, and to learn that sometimes the person we least expect is the one we should have been listening to all along.